light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. There goes sooner lady, and welcome this fine Father's Day Sunday morning here. As we know that there are many fathers and grandfathers who are patients in the hospital this morning, as well as staff members. So we want to recognize your presence here with us today. And as we get started here, we're going to do a reading from Psalm 43, which is, all right, here. Vindicate me, O God, and defend my cause against an ungodly people. From those who are deceitful and unjust, deliver me. For you are the God in whom I take refuge. Why have you cast me off? Why must I walk about mournfully because of the oppression of the enemy? Oh, send out your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy. And I will praise you with the heart, O God, my God. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my help and my God. This week our readings combines Psalms 42 and Psalm 43, and we heard Psalm 42 earlier. And as we think about what's going on today, there's a lot happening in the world today, and especially given that it's Father's Day. And, you know, for many of us, or many people here in North America and around the world, today is a day of great joy. Joy that it's Father's Day, and they're celebrating with their fathers, their dads, maybe even at a distance, talking on the phone, doing a little Skype, or Google Hangout with Dad. And having that connection. And that's a pretty awesome thing, but there are also many people who are sad today because their dads aren't with them anymore. And they are unable to celebrate that sharing that they had previously experienced in their lives. And so as we look at that and think about that today, we want to look at what does loss mean in our lives. You know, many people have different feelings about loss. They experience different feelings during times of loss. And there are many kinds of loss that people get caught up in. You know, when we think about loss, especially at this time, with Father's Day going on, we think about those who have passed on. And this is very, very real also for, as was brought up earlier, Chaplain Kirk is grieving the loss of his sister-in-law, and I'm grieving myself the loss of my aunt, my favorite aunt in Tulsa, who died Friday. And so, you know, it's a very real and personal experience this weekend as I'm talking about this. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we handle loss? Now, as soldiers, and growing up here in Oklahoma, you know, there's that whole pioneer model of Christianity where it's the, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be strong, be tough. And so we're supposed to like shut our feelings down, you know, get through it, get beyond, and just tough it out. Well, and that doesn't really work very often. You know, that doesn't really help us to move through that healing process in a good way. And so we want to look at why that came about and what can we do differently that might help us and our families. Because, you know, when you think about what's involved in investing in your emotional bank accounts with your family members, with your coworkers, with your friends, it's hard to invest in those emotional bank accounts when you're not emotionally available, when you're stuck, when you're caught up in that grief, in that suffering, in that loss. And the kinds of loss that we experience are pretty varied. You know, today we think about the death of loved ones. Specifically, we also think about loss of job, loss of health, loss of divorce, even feelings of abandonment. You know, how often have somebody, or you experienced yourself or a family member, ever felt like they were abandoned? Or how many times have you been in tough situations where you felt that God had turned his back on you, that you had been abandoned by God? That's a real sense of loss. That can be interpreted as depression. I mean, we're in this hospital. There are a lot of patients who come to this hospital who are suffering from depression as a result of what they've experienced in their military service. There are staff members who deal with this issue because of challenges in their families. Whatever's happened in our lives that can cause that depression, there are different ways of treating it. Now, the clinical method, because back in the day before I got into chaplaincy, I was a therapist, and the clinical method for dealing with loss was to look at, first of all, a mood stabilizer, get a medication going, and that's okay, because you know when you're dealing with intense loss and you've got that intense grief going on, it's hard to really focus sometimes, and it's hard to really push through that and cope in a good way. So those medications do serve a valid and important purpose in our healing process. Once you have that mood stabilization, though, many people just quit. They stop working on it. They say, okay, I feel better now, I'll just keep taking the pills. I don't have to worry about it. I can't begin to tell you how many patients that I have worked with in chaplaincy and also as a therapist who were unwilling to emotionally invest themselves in dealing with the underlying feelings and problems that created that depression in the first place. And so when they stopped receiving their medications, all that stuff came right back up again. Let me give you an illustration about that. There's a lot of people out in this world today, especially here in Oklahoma where we live, who self-medicate because they can't afford the medications that they need to deal with all that pain and suffering. And so they use alcohol, they use drugs. When people get caught up in that level of self-medication that they become addicts, they get stuck emotionally and spiritually in their maturity at that point. They stop growing. When they get off of those drugs, alcohol and drugs combined, because alcohol actually is the strongest drug in the world. It affects every nerve in the body, or every neuroreceptor in the body. When they stop taking all that, everything comes back up. And suddenly they realize, oh, I've got to still grow up. They have to pick up where they left off. And for some people, that can be quite a journey. And they have feelings of left out, they still feel excluded, not a part of the community, not a part of the family. A lot going on there that triggers that sense of loss, of not belonging. Now, Walter Brueggemann, he's a theologian who described the process of facing that challenge and moving through it as having orientation. First thing you do is you start with, you're feeling pretty good about yourself, your life is going along just fine, and then the world shows up. And like the psalmist, who crying out here says, everything fell apart. Your world falls apart. You're feeling that loss very strongly. You're feeling that sense of sadness and anguish. As a psalmist, he's not just talking about feeling sad. He's talking about the anguish that he is experiencing in his life. And you're feeling that very strongly. And that creates what he calls disorientation. That's what Brueggemann calls disorientation. Everything falls apart. You feel completely lost. You don't know where you fit in. You don't even feel connected to yourself, to anybody else. Everything's in chaos. When you get into that place, what do? Well, many people shut down. That's what they do. They become completely emotionally unavailable. How do you know when somebody's suffering from PTSD? They are completely shut down emotionally. They're not available. It's pretty obvious, pretty evident. They feel sad all the time. They got a real dejected look or faraway look in their eyes. No feelings expressed on the face at all. Nothing there. You can tell somebody's in that place of disorientation. They're really closed up. They're not emotionally available. They're not nurturing and supportive of their family members. They're not thinking about the wonderful things that life has to offer. They're not having fun. They quit doing the things that they used to do that they loved. And I can tell you that my dad went through that when he went to Nam back in the early 60s. Before he went to Nam, and I remember this clearly because I was like 5, 6 years old, and before he went to Nam, we were barbecue kings on the base. Everybody loved to come to our place. Every month we would have a group barbecue. It was fun. I remember that. I still love having group barbecues. Big families, friends, everybody just come on over. We play the Beatles, we play some country music, we have a good time. When he came back from Nam, that all went away. It stopped. It was over. All he cared about from that point on was shooting guns and being around people who were drinking and shooting guns. That's it. And that went on for a long time. And that made it pretty rough on all of us family members and all the people in the community. He lost all of his friends because he couldn't bring himself to work through that process, to face that disorientation and move into what Brueggemann calls a new orientation. When you are confronted with that difficult challenge, that depression, that sadness, that grief, that anguish, for whatever reason, and you move through that, as the psalmist has done, then you create a new orientation. You have a new relationship with yourself, a new relationship with God, and a new relationship with the people around you. Hopefully, and for most people, a better one, where the family really loves being around you, especially on Father's Day, versus, oh crap, it's another Father's Day, we gotta call Dad. Well, let's put it off till late tonight, the last minute, so we don't have to talk very long. You see what I'm talking about? It makes a difference. Now, that makes it sound pretty easy, doesn't it? You move from one step to the next step and it's over. Well, it's not that easy. In fact, it's downright challenging. And we know that Jesus thought a lot about it. Jesus talked a lot about loss in our lives. For example, in John 14, verses 1 through 4, it reads, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that? I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I am going." Jesus was acknowledging that we suffer from loss in our lives, and he was giving us a sense of hope to believe in, that there is a place for us down the road when this worldly suffering ends. There is a place for us to be, and we're going to be with him. Jesus gives us that hope. Jesus is affirming in John 14 what the psalmist is experiencing and saying. And that takes us to Frank Lake, another theologian. He's a British theologian, and he was a chaplain who wrote a book called Clinical Theology. And in that he talked about lamenting loss. Lament is the theological term for depression. You're feeling a sense of loss, feeling a sense of depression. How do you get through it from a theological perspective? Now, I can tell you, as a therapist, there were some good methods and that were helpful to a lot of people for moving through loss and grief, but nothing helped more than being able to look at how the psalmist helped himself through that process, what he did to get through it. Nothing helped more than being able to do that people could relate to and say, oh yeah, I understand. I get that. So we're going to look at what the psalmist did from the clinical theological perspective. The first thing that Frank Lake says that the psalmist did was he got honest about his feelings. He didn't try to pretend he didn't have them. He didn't try to shove them out of the way, to lock them up somewhere, compartmentalize them someplace in our brain. he allowed himself to say, I feel grief, I feel anguish, I feel suffering, and it's okay. Owning your feelings in times of difficulty takes a lot of courage. And in our society right now, that kind of courage, that kind of vulnerability can be challenging because many people might think you're weak if you express yourself, you express your feelings in that way. And that needs to be changed. That needs to be changed. And that starts with you setting an example for your family members, for your friends, by saying it's okay for me to have my feelings. So it's okay to acknowledge those feelings that you experience. It may be hard for you to do that, especially if you're not used to it. But you can do it. And the psalmist showed us that it can be done. The second part of this is that not only did the psalmist acknowledge his feelings, he acknowledged them directly to God. He knew that God was there. He felt abandoned by God. He felt rejected by God. The verses are very clear about that. It's like, where are you, God? Why aren't you helping me out here? But he knew that even if God's back was turned to him, God was still there. So he shared his feelings with God. He got them out there. Now that requires what you might call conversation with God. When's the last time you talked to God? I'm not talking about praying. I'm not talking about shouting, although you can shout. Being angry with God is okay. And if God ever asks you, how come you're angry with me, just say Chaplain Davis said it was okay, because it is. So you go right ahead. Be angry with God. Sometimes it's hard to be in this world. And so that comes out. And the psalmist appears at this point that he has anguish, and he's sharing it with God. It's like, why am I suffering so much when you're my God? He challenged God, put it right in his face. And that's okay. God didn't smite him. He didn't get hit by a lightning bolt. He wasn't turned into a pillar of salt. It's okay. It's essential part of moving through that lamenting process to share your feelings with God. And you can do it wherever you feel right, wherever you feel comfortable. Be in your bedroom, on your back porch, out in the middle of the woods, in your church, right here in this chapel. You can come down here anytime you want and go for it. Share your feelings with God. I'm okay with that. We're all here for you. The next thing that Frank Lake says that the psalmist points out is that the psalmist affirms that the reality that he is experiencing is the way God made this world. God created the heaven and the earth and all therein. That means God created a world where there is suffering, where there is loss. And when we come to that place where we accept that maybe sometimes the suffering, the loss we experience is because that's the way God created reality, we come to a place of acceptance. This is the way God created the world. Because God does have the power to change it anytime God wants to. But God's not doing that. God's using us to change the world, to create the reality that we want. And so we have to come to that place of acceptance that the world is right now the way it is because that's how God wants it to be. And that might fly in the face of a lot of different theologies you may have heard. But that's what we have reality checks for. And that's what the psalmist did. The psalmist came to that place of acceptance that the reality is God made it that way. So there must be a reason. And just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that God doesn't have a reason for it. A good reason. One that down the road, at some point, we will understand, we will comprehend. I am absolutely certain of that. But today, we have our feelings, and that's okay. Now the next thing, and this is a little different perspective. This is where you kind of have to think about yourself in the mirror. Have a conversation with yourself. Because what the psalmist did is he moved beyond acknowledging his feelings, expressing them clearly to God, accepting the reality that God has created, into, why am I feeling so depressed? Why am I feeling so sad? What's wrong with this picture? The psalmist confronts his feelings by asking himself, why is he depressed? Why is he lamenting? In asking that question, the psalmist is exploring, well, what are my expectations here? What was I really looking for? Was I looking for everyone to live forever in this world? Was I expecting something that was unrealistic? Was I expecting all those soldiers, all those enemy fighters, wherever they might have been, to just stand up and put down their weapons and pretend like it was all a big misunderstanding? What are my expectations here? Were they realistic? What am I looking for out of this? The psalmist did a little self-examination. What are my motives and expectations of God? Do I think that I should be treated special? That I should be different from everybody else and not have to experience this kind of suffering? What can I learn from this? So Frank Black decides that he kind of had he set his ego aside. And he looked at himself objectively. And he found the answer he was looking for. He got to know himself a little better. And that helped him out. The fifth thing that he did is that he reminded himself that we are living on God's time and not our own. We're living on God's schedule and not our schedule. We like to think we are living on our schedule. We set our agendas at the beginning of the week. I've got a background in business too, and of course, when you're running a church, you got to have a schedule. I mean, you just can't run a church without a schedule. So you start at the beginning of the week, you get your schedule all figured out, your goals and objectives for the week and for the day, and then life happens. And you have to do a little self-regulation there. You have to prioritize. You got to move through the process. So we like to think we're in charge. We're the ones in control. We got it going on. Well, then life happens, big time. And we find out we're not. We're living on God's schedule, God's time. And the psalmist reminds himself at this point that, yeah, we are living in God's time, and we have to be patient. Patient on God. Patient with God. He reminded himself that God's in charge. And as much as we might want something, doesn't mean we're necessarily going to get it in our time. We have to be patient and allow God to operate on God's time. Catch up with God's time. Walk in harmony with God's time. That's what we have to do. And the psalmist reminded himself, oh yeah, this is what's really going on. So let me relax and be at peace with this. It's all good. It's okay. And we move through that process of that lamentation there. The sixth thing that the psalmist did, which was really, really important, is no matter how bad things got or how bad things appeared to be for him, he remembered that God loves him. He started thinking about all the times in his life that God has done something wonderful for him. this reminds me of the hymn of our hymn book here. You know, we got our different hymn books. I'm not sure if yours has got it, but in this hymn book, we sang this song the other day, and it's perfect for this week. It's Psalm 384, when upon life's billows, but you also might know it as count your many blessings. And the way the verse goes is, when upon life's billows you are tempest tossed. When you are discouraged, thinking all is lost. Count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what God has done. The psalmist set that example on how to lament and go through that healing process of lamenting by remembering the blessings that he has had in his life. How much intervention that God has done for him through this whole process. You know, you're alive. You have another opportunity to live a better quality of life. No matter how bad your situation is right now, health-wise, whatever, you have the opportunity to improve the quality of your relationships with friends, with family members, make amends, you know, share your feelings with God, develop your relationship with God a little better today. As long as you're breathing, you have that opportunity. It's up to you to choose whether or not to take advantage of it. The psalmist chose to take advantage of it. The psalmist chose to count his blessings. And in so doing, he started feeling better about himself, about his situation, and about his relationship with God. And he came to realize that God didn't abandon him. God didn't even turn God's back on him. God was always there, right by his side, lamenting right there with him. Because God never leaves us alone, ever, no matter what. And the psalmist realized that. That's one of the great blessings in his life, is that God is ever present. Always got somebody to talk to. Always have somebody to talk to. Because God's always listening. The final thing that Frank Lake points out that the psalmist did, or we want to affirm, which is why I brought up John 14, is that the psalmist affirms God's redemption. He remembered the hope that he has in his life because of God's forgiveness, God's love, God's acceptance of us for who we are and where we're at in our lives. In our own experience, in our own life experience, we know that Jesus came into the world, suffered and died and was raised again to remind us that no matter how bad things get in this world, we have a place to be. And it will always be there. Never goes away. We have a home with Christ. We have a relationship with Christ. We have a relationship with God. We always have people who want to be with us. And that's pretty awesome. That gives us hope for down the road. Something to look forward to. Something to live for. And that's one other component I want to bring up. You know, I surprised a bunch of people the other day. We were doing a group discussion with a bunch of beginning chaplains. I've been in ministry a long time, and we were getting into talking about the feelings and the hard stuff. And I was talking about soldiers, because a lot of them aren't veterans, and some of them were. And I said, as veterans, we do get caught up in that suffering, and we learn in our own life experience how not to be afraid of dying. Just about every soldier I've ever known throughout my entire life, and I grew up in the military, so I've known a lot of soldiers in my life, are not afraid of dying. But the other side of that coin is that not being afraid of dying, there is another side of that coin. And the other side of that coin is that most of the soldiers that I have known in my life have been afraid of living. of experiencing the joy and the wonder of life, because they're so caught up in that suffering that they never move through that lamentation process to be able to get back into experiencing joy. Joy in God's presence, joy in God's relationship, joy in family and community, and I mean real joy. And moving through the laments, when, that's what it's all about. Lamenting is about acknowledging grief and being able to make peace with it so that you can get back on the road of joy. Get back on the road of being emotionally available to your family, to your friends, to your community, even your coworkers, especially them probably, because they're the ones who know you the best, most likely. So that's the great opportunity that you have in lamenting. It is an opportunity to do healing, to step beyond the suffering and challenges of this world, to move up to that next level of living life on the same level that Jesus lived life. Jesus loved joy. He had a good time. Just read the scriptures. He'll tell you his life experience was fun, despite all the suffering. Even after he's resurrected, he came right back and said, hey, let's eat. He was about the joy of living. It is about the joy of living. So if you're feeling in that situation where you're lamenting, I encourage you to reach out, to ask for some assistance. We have chaplains who are available. Be happy to be there and support you as best we can. Reach out, talk to somebody. Get some help. The psalmist did it on his own, and that seemed to be working for him, at least according to the way we read it. We know he wasn't on his own. We know that King David had a large community around him most of the time. And there are many laments in Psalms. The whole book of Psalms is one great big lament for most people. And there's plenty of opportunity to learn how to move through anguish, grief, and loss, whatever kind of loss you experience, and get back on the road to joy in your life, having good quality relationship and experiencing the wonder of life. So I encourage you to reach out when you need to. Walk in beauty. Father. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little